Today we're speaking with Leo Kennedy, great-grandson of Sergeant Michael Kennedy. He was one of the police officers murdered by infamous Australian bushranger Ned Kelly in one of the country's most notable historical events in the Stringybark Creek massacre in the state of Victoria. The story of Ned Kelly is Australian folklore, considered a hero by much of the country as someone who stuck it to the law. He was captured in 1880 during a shootout with police while wearing makeshift body armor and subsequently was hanged after being found guilty. Leo's written a new book titled Black Snake, The Real Story of Ned Kelly, and he joins us today. So how are you this morning, Leo?
Very well, Jess. How are you going?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. Doing a bit of last-minute research last night before we were able to get you on the phone for this podcast today. I think as we spoke just briefly before we turned on the recording, I'm Canadian originally. I moved out here sometime around 2004, so I didn't grow up with the myth of Ned Kelly, but it's certainly something I've grown to be familiar with while living out here. And as we're both located in the country, a lot of people will listen to this who are based overseas and probably are unfamiliar with Ned Kelly and his story and myth. So would you mind just taking a minute to take us through who he is as a person and his stature in Australian folklore?
Well, Ned Kelly was the child of a convict and a young lady that came out from Ireland. He had quite a shocking upbringing as a child. He ended up watching his father die of alcoholism, and he didn't have very good role models with the remaining males that were left around the place, such as his uncles on the Kelly side and uncles on the Quinn side. They were in and out of jail for horse theft or bashing people. So quite a horrible upbringing. He was a truant. He had the opportunity to really start on a farm, etc., and have a normal life, but chose not to go that way. He went into, shall we say, the family business. Surprisingly, his mother apprenticed him to a bushranger called Harry Power, and he got that taste for having control over people with a gun. He was caught, and he gave Harry Power away. Out of that, the police basically talked Ned round to giving up Harry Power for Ned's freedom. But out of all that, when he did have the opportunity to go straight, he didn't take it. And again, back into the family business. Over time, his crimes just grew more and more violent and more audacious. He went from horse theft to attempted murder of a policeman to the murder of 3 police at Stringybark Creek and became outlawed along with others that took part in those murders, and then took a role of basically performing terrorist acts, taking over, for example, stations, equivalent of a ranch in another country, holding people hostage, robbing banks, and basically terrorising a large area of the colony of Victoria as it was at the time, and even up into New South Wales, another colony. And it ended with a shootout with police, and horribly, again, he had hostages, and those hostages wore some of the police bullets. So there was a lot of damage to a lot of people, other than the outlaws who were in makeshift armour, which instead of protecting them, ultimately it was their downfall. It trapped them. And yes, he was hanged for his crime of the murder of one policeman. That's all he ultimately ended up being hanged for. But there were a whole lot of other horrible events and victims of Ned Kelly. And from there, somehow, and I think it may have been the aura of the armour and the audaciousness of his acts, he began to be glorified, because no one could really fathom the audacity of him. And over time, and through movies and popularisation and art and media, his criminality got brushed away, and more he became a hero, as distinct from an anti-hero. Instead of infamous, he started to be described as famous. And coming from the perspective of the victims of Ned Kelly. This is just quite hard to take, given the shocking crimes that he committed.
Now, as well, you're the great-grandson of Sergeant Michael Kennedy, who was murdered at this point in time. Can you provide a little bit of background on your own family history? Because I'm quite interested as well. Both families on sides of the law here were Irish resettlers, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. So if you do a comparison between Sergeant Michael Kennedy and Ned Kelly, I described Ned Kelly's impoverished upbringing and quite a shocking upbringing. Michael Kennedy had an impoverished upbringing also. He survived through the potato famine in Ireland. However, he was brought up in a lawful family. His parents were tenant farmers. He worked hard. He went all the way through school as far as he could, and only one son could stay on the land, and that was his older brother. Michael became a labourer, and then he saw an opportunity, and whereas Ned went and was an apprentice to a bushranger, Michael became a policeman in the Dublin Constabulary, and he was there for almost 2 years. In that time there, he observed and talked to a lot of the Dubliners that were leaving and going to Victoria, this land of opportunity. You could find gold, you could own land, and with that opportunity to own land, that was something very attractive to the Irish who could not. They were all tenants at that stage, and apart from the English landlords. But the other element there was, as a constable in the police force, you could marry. You could not do that in Ireland, but you could do it in Victoria. So there was all these attractions to go. So he went home and with his parents gathered up their belongings and headed out to Victoria. So you've got, I suppose, a bit of an anomaly here, that both from Irish backgrounds and both impoverished. However, look at the different result. One aspired to be lawful, became a policeman, and his reputation as a policeman was described as exemplary. Reading his police record is quite amazing. You see these words such as zeal, acting courageously, and in one area that he worked, in an area called Doon, he was given a testimonial, and his send-off was the equivalent of a year's salary. That's how much they appreciated him being there and protecting their community. So quite a different person to what Ned Kelly became.
And so what do we know about police officers around that time? So I last night, because Ned Kelly, for listeners, he sort of fits into this Australian mythology, and a lot of this has to do with, the Southern Cross and the Eureka Stockade. And while I was reading about that as well, they're talking about how even the stockade was 2 or 3 decades beforehand. They're talking about how a lot of the police officers were crims who had served their time. So was there still this sort of mix mash of criminals who were police officers, or were they finally bringing them over from the homeland?
Correct. There was quite a change occurred in policing. So whereas 20 plus years before, they were quite desperate to get police and grab basically people who were not necessarily perfect and from not perfect backgrounds. You roll forward this 20 years and you've got Victoria growing from a population of 50,000 to 500,000 people in a very short space of time, about a decade. You have this massive influx. So just imagine it. You've got 500,000 people. 20% of the population is actually Chinese because of all the gold, and also some of them were indentured labour. But when you look at the police force, the 1,100 men, 80% of them were Irish. They were the poorest of the poor, taking the job that nobody else wanted. Only 30 police were actually born in the state of Victoria. So you had this quite odd mix, and of them, about 40% had been in the Irish Constabulary and about 5% had been in the Dublin Constabulary. And they were quite different police forces. The Irish Constabulary did have a reputation for cracking down on anyone who was out of line. They were quite harsh. No two ways about it. The Dubliners had different methods, and Michael was a Dubliner. But you had this mix of policing. You also had, they imported 50 London policemen to try and instill what the bobbies did in London into the Victorian police force. So you had these different, I suppose, three main different influences in the Victorian police force.
Do you find, the book is about changing the perception or getting to the truth of who Ned Kelly was, but for people like myself, there's the perception of sort of the dubious history of police work around this time when it was a little bit more lawless. Is this another area of conversations where you have to sort of explain? Because you're talking about your great-grandfather in an exemplary fashion based on documentation, but again, the culture, the myth, and the movies that were fed sort of provide this context of pretty dirty police around that sort of time who took it upon themselves to interpret the law in their own way.
So there was a mixture. There are characters in Ned's life, such as Constable Hall, Irish Constabulary. He really did work hard on people. No two ways about it. He was a tough cop. He interpreted the law in his own way, and that's what I was trying to get to before. Was the Irish Constabulary behaved in that rough type of way. The Dubliners did not. The Londoners did not. They were policing for the people. They were there to protect the community, and that's the way they went about their business. So if you take also who they were dealing with, there was an influx from Van Diemen's Land, another colony in Australia.
So we'll say Tasmania for listeners.
Tasmania, you would say today, that's correct. There was 9,000 ex-convicts came in, and they took it upon themselves to defy authority, and they really just transposed what they thought about their guards onto the Victorian police force. And that's one of those, for example, was Ned Kellys' father. So a lot of Ned's attitudes towards police, etc., came from his father, and that attitude of anti-authority and don't trust the police. But it's a gross generalisation to describe all police in that way. And it's not just Michael's police record. A policeman who is working on Stringybark Creek and revitalising what's presented there in the last few months visited Mansfield, which was Michael's last town, and people he met in the street today describe how their grandparents and great-grandparents described Michael Kennedy as a great policeman, as a man of his community. So it's not just from his record, it is from the community he worked in. His reputation and his memory are preserved in people's oral histories of what a good policeman, what a fair policeman he was. And these were really tough times on the police as well as on everybody else. No one had an easy time in those days. They had to deal with drought, they had to deal with flood, they had to deal with a new country in a different environment. And then on top of that, they had to deal with people like Ned Kelly who were stealing their horses and stealing their cattle, which was really driving them down rather than raising them up. So they looked upon police to provide that sense of confidence so that they could go about their business, so they could feel, so that they felt safe and secure.
Well, it's probably due to get onto that, but you've touched on quite a few interesting points. Do you know much of the historical sort of Irish diaspora that ended up in Victoria? I mean, it's quite interesting what you're saying about the hardline policing of Dubliners. Is there a reason why they were so much, I guess, for lack of a better term, violent, I guess, compared to the other two groups of police?
So just to clarify, there was the Irish Constabulary that were the more violent ones.
Okay.
The Dubliners were the peacekeepers.
Okay.
So what I've studied and researched in relation to the Irish Constabulary, they cracked down on a lot of dissent that arose within Ireland itself. So they had to do some pretty harsh acts under the instruction of basically a British government. So they did crack down on people that wanted freedom, wanted their rights, etc. They did not allow people to assemble. They did not allow people to express their views in any way, shape or form. That they were tough. So that was really the background of the Irish Constabulary. The Dubliners within Dublin were different and did different types of policing to the example I've given for the Irish Constabulary.
And so with the Irish coming to Australia, was the Great Famine or the Potato Famine, was that one of the key drivers of why we saw this mass immigration?
And it's with the Irish diaspora that they did go to other places in the world, United States, North America, etc. A lot of it was around, they could not own land. They were hungry. They had to give part of what they earned to a church they didn't even belong to. They wanted to get away and they wanted to start in a new life and a new place. So that's where, when someone's talking about the opportunity to find gold, to own land, to have more freedoms than you have in your own country, and to not be hungry, there's a lot of attraction to get out of where you are and move away.
So, getting back to elements of the book, where did the title come from? Black Snake is it's clearly not too positive. What was the motivation for titling the book that?
It was using some of the very few words that we have recorded of what Ned ever wrote. So when Ned did give away Harry Power, the Bushranger, he was treated within his own people, his own community, as a black snake, so-called, because he had ratted on Harry Power, he'd given him away, so therefore he was blackened and he was behaving like a snake. Hence, that's what he wrote to the police, because the police said to him, look, if you want to get out of your situation, write to us, contact us, and we will give you an opportunity to start anew somewhere else. And so he wrote, everyone looks upon me as though I am a black snake. Please respond as soon as possible. Basically saying, get me the heck out of where I am. And the police did help him, or tried to. They found him a place up in New South Wales, many miles away from where he was living, on a sheep station. So he could have started a new life on a farm, away from it all, and had a new beginning. But he decided not to, or his mother decided for him not to, and he had to stay where he was, within his own, and tough it out. And to survive, he had to get tougher, meaner, nastier, and also show that he was not going to be a toady to Constable Hall any longer. He was not going to accept the rule of law or what police told him to do. He was going to be a Kelly.
What do we know much about his mother? Because what you're talking about him is sort of this person who's forcing him into being a bushranger apprentice, preventing him from moving on to become a good citizen. She sounds almost worse of the two in terms of her parenting skills.
It's a bit hard to pick exactly where Ellen was in some of these aspects. There's been that much written about her and around her. And I do know Kelly descendants, but it's a place they don't wish to go when I talk to them about this. And I don't know whether that's because she was the mother. But when you look at what was going on, he lost his father at the age of 11. The decisions were being made by the mother. And also her links with her uncle, his uncles. You've got his uncles into horse thieving, his uncle's into bashing people, and there's this association of who does Ned go with, who does Ned ride with, who is in jail, who is not in jail. So for a time it was Harry Power, and then who is it after that he is then being placed with or told to go with by his mother until he starts to make his own decisions. So at that, in his teen years, from 11 into his teens, she is the influential person. She is the one who has the contacts. She is the one who's running a shanty. But in her defence, she has no husband. She has very few ways to make an income and earn a living. So what are her choices, given she has quite a number of young children? She was in quite a desperate situation, I would say, in her defence. But rather than be lawful, it looks very like, and even the fact she ran a shanty, she did not get a liquor licence. She sold illegal liquor. So very much she was on the lawless side.
I guess we'll just clarify the question. So Ned Kelly grew up and he became a bushranger. For people who are unfamiliar, because it's a very Australian term, would you classify that exactly the same as an outlaw in sort of American cowboy culture?
There are similarities. Whether it's your Jesse James in the United States or a character like that, someone who started off perhaps in theft and then moved on into other illegal, violent practices. So typically a bushranger would act outside the law, and whether it was Harry Power who would hold people up, whether it was an individual or a stagecoach at the point of a gun. And I suppose that's the traditional thing, and what people see in movies is that holding up of people. But Kelly's acts were different, and there's various stages. So in one stage, he was a horse thief and a cattle thief and a thug. He would booze, he would bash people, he would stage fights, and there'd be bets on them. That was his life. But from there, he escalated into more and more aggressive horse thefts, taking large numbers of horses at a time, quite defiant. And then into, and why he was an outlaw as distinct from a bushranger, because I suppose it's one of those legal terms. There were bushrangers, but they weren't necessarily outlawed. Whereas I suppose in the United States and Northern America, it would be someone is an outlaw because there has been that act or offence by them where they have been declared an outlaw. So that's one of the differences is there was a Felons Apprehension Act initiated after the murders at Stringybark Creek. And Ned Kelly, his brother Dan, Joe Byrne and Steve Hart were declared outlaws in the Victorian sense of the word because of the murders of 3 policemen.
At the time, you mentioned Ned Kelly writing. What was his relationship with the media? Because it sounds like he would have letters published. Would this get out across Australia as we know it at that point in time? Would this media go overseas back to the motherland of England?
So with the media, after Ned was declared an outlaw, he had written the letter to police, which included Black Snake in it, but apart from that, he could barely read and barely write, and people would read newspapers to him, and he would dictate. So the Cameron letter and then the Heralded letter, which was really an enhanced version of the Cameron letter, were letters that he dictated. There was a lot of concoction in them. There was a lot of vivid language in them. He claimed victim status, and then he threatened to terrorise in the same letter. And what he did with those letters was he tried to, the first one he sent to a politician, and the politician didn't do anything with it. But with the Heralded letter, he actually tried to get it published. But the publisher in Heralded had escaped the town, so he handed it to a bank teller. And there it sat. But parts of it were put up and published and released into the media. And the media fed off this story of Ned Kelly and his outrages all through the time after the Stringybark Creek murders. It was one of those news stories that kept going, and he was more and more audacious with his taking of hostages and robbing banks. So the media fed off it, and it was part of what went into the media. But as well as what he put into the media, he also wrote a number with his gang and him dictating, had a number of poison pen letters written to various police, promising to stuff them into a hollow log of a tree and set it on fire, and all these kinds of threats towards them. So there was this, I suppose, campaign of nasty letters to police as well going on in the midst of everything else he was doing.
And it culminates in this shootout in Glen, Rowan in Victoria, which involves your grandfather. And now, one of the historians that I was listening to the other night had said that, during the time you talk about the wording and the violence implicit in Ned Kelly's writing, but he was saying that at the same point in time, police were also boasting that they were going to, kill him or that they were going to shoot to kill. Is that part of, in your opinion, or what you found, part of this hyperbole, or is there any truth to that as well?
I would call it hyperbole. So just to clarify, in your lead in there, Stringybark Creek occurred in October 1878, and that's where my great-grandfather was murdered, along with two other police. Glen Rowan happened about 20 months later in June 1880. And that's where a number of police ultimately surrounded the Kellys at an inn at Glen Rowan. So he talked within the heralded letter of police being violent and police saying they were going to kill him in there, and also back at Stringybark Creek. At Stringybark Creek, with the policeman he captured, he kept on taunting this policeman, saying, "You came to kill me, you came to kill me," just like those bastards over in New South Wales did to that other person. Words to that effect. So what he was trying to justify there was, I'm attacking you because you came to kill me. But there was nothing in it. Sergeant Kennedy had a record for capturing people. The warrants were for the arrest of the two brothers. They went with 2 sets of handcuffs and the limited weapons they could obtain to perform the capture. So a whole lot of hyperbole from Ned, basically to justify his action for attacking the police rather than him taking off and fleeing away from them.
Okay. And what do we know about him while he was alive and the perception of him? I've read that he was able to avoid capture for a few years through a network of supporters. And even upon his capture, there were thousands of people demanding his release. Can you frame, I guess, the personality of Ned Kelly while he was alive?
So while Ned was alive, he did have a group of sympathisers. Quite a number of them were family and extended family through intermarrying and various contacts. So placed in the areas he stole and moved cattle to and from, he had what were termed sympathisers. They were in on his thieving, and then when he became outlawed, yes, they did in different ways support him, hide him, provide him with information, provide him with food. Not necessarily all of them, some of them. And this is where, when writers get a hold of it, they seem to extrapolate the numbers. So the family and friends interconnections that were in the business, so to speak, was in the vicinity of 100 to 150 people in an area that comprised over 10,000 people. Those he robbed and stole from and threatened, of that 10,000, did not like Ned Kelly. They were not fans of Ned Kelly. And then, ultimately, after he was captured at Glen Rowan and tried for the murder of Lonergan and convicted to hang, there was a petition that did get circulated. It ended up with a whole lot of false names, forgeries, in amongst some genuine signings. So whilst there were over 30,000 supposed signatures, it wasn't all real. And this is one of the myths that gets played up is, there were over 30,000 signatures calling for him to be reprieved from being hanged, but that he remain in jail for the rest of his life, versus how many were actually true signatures versus the ones who signed out of fear as well, which is also stated and captured in my manuscript and partly in my book.
And there is, just already from what I've read online, some of the individual reviews of the book, there's a bit of anger over the repurposing of Ned Kellys history. Why? I guess we'll talk about first of why people are angry about that. But at what point did you notice the perception of Ned Kelly moving from crim to national icon or hero?
Probably I was born into it, but protected from it. So it's really as I grew from and finding out about the age of 7 into my teens, I realised, hang on a minute, some people actually believe this guy was okay in some way because he had a poke at authority, he defied authority. But that seemed to be all it was at that stage. It really took on a life of its own after the centenary in 1978, where tourism bought into it. So in addition to a series of bad movies and books that were all about Ned and not about his victims, you suddenly had a tourist trail. And along that tourist trail, the police were portrayed as bad guys. Ned was portrayed as a victim. His victims were portrayed as nuisances or complainers, etc. So everything was turned towards Ned and this Nedification and glorification of his acts, even though they included bashings, theft, murder, hostage-taking, and even a terrorist act of trying to have a train tip off its tracks and derail.
Ed, for people that aren't from Australia, can you sort of explain this true blue culture? Because this is what I've really noticed him integrate with. I see, Ned Kelly sort of mixed in, I think, as I spoke with earlier, around, the tales of the Eureka Stockade, the Southern Cross flag. This is sort of, when you see, workers' demonstrations, it's all sort of blended in with this CFMEU sort of culture. It's pretty uniquely Australian. Could you sort of provide a bit of summation for people that I guess don't live here or didn't grow up with that?
It's a little bit hard for me to explain actually because I don't buy into it at all. I'm completely puzzled as to people who try and make links between the Eureka Stockade, where downtrodden miners who had to pay very expensive licences and were badly treated by rough police, stood up for their rights. That's quite a different situation to someone who was a horse thief and was put out of business by the police, basically, and then became an outlaw. So I don't allow or cannot justify any connection between what the protesters at Eureka Stockade did and Ned Kelly, who was a murderer. The Eureka Stockade people were not. And people trying to link to that. It really, to me, gets back to this iconic armour of his and use as a symbol, but also what some writers have done where they've added myth and mistakes and given Ned causes that he never belonged to. This is a guy who stood over people, but unions, for whatever reason, claim he stood up for the rights of the poor and the downtrodden. He did not. it's a mistake, it's an error to use him in that way. Some claim he was a Republican, and that is an utter falsehood. He never used the word. Kelly gang descendants completely refute it. It is an absolute myth. So you have this problem that people have used him to represent things that he never ever stood for.
Interesting. This happened more than a century ago. I mean, how did you get involved in this, and why? What's your interest, and how has this affected you personally? Because it's generations removed from your own life now.
Well, I grew up in a family in a house where his name was never mentioned, but I grew up with these stories about a exemplary policeman who was murdered in the performance of his duty, and a stoic widow that brought up their 5 children after he was killed. So that they were, I suppose, my heroes, and the people I looked up to were people that stood up for right, looked after people in the community, and contributed. So that was, I suppose, where I came from, and it was just this complete surprise that people would think of the person who murdered my great-grandfather in any way as some sort of symbol to look up to. So that's what I had to wrestle with for my life, is that complete opposite position that's occurred with some people.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of times that you're in contact or speak with the Kelly family relatives. Do you want to talk about how that started and the relationship that you have with them these days?
So in my quest to get the truth told about the police so that as a family we could remember them respectfully, I got involved with a Kelly descendant through a documentary. I needed an archaeologist to relocate the correct places where the police camp was at Stringybark Creek, where they were attacked, and where my great-grandfather had been murdered by the Kelly gang.
How did they fix that problem? Because I've read previously that tours and things were presenting the wrong side of the creek as the scene of the shootout, and that's one of the things that you had to correct.
That's right. So for 25 years, people were taken to the wrong side of the creek. So by being involved in this documentary, I believe the only way I could get it resolved was to engage an archaeologist. I could not afford an archaeologist, but by participating in a documentary, they would have the archaeologist. So that's how I achieved that. Through that documentary, I met a Kelly descendant, and we walked around for a day on set, mic'd up, and talking, and we shared elements of our family history. And it was very obvious to us very soon that we had more in common than we had different. Both our families had been negatively impacted by the myth. Other people had taken our story and our people and turned them into something they were not. People were making money out of this story and not listening to us and not letting us tell our story. So that's why we decided we should help one another. We both have hurting families, and the impact has been quite bad on some members of our families over time. And we are just so sick and fed up with the pain caused to our family by people who are making money out of it and not letting us tell the truth and them not showing the truth. Hence, the rework of Stringybark Creek, the writing of a book.
And I, from what I've gathered as well, the Kelly family also rejects the current myth of the heroics of Ned Kelly. I find that quite interesting because it seems like they could benefit from this. In your discussions with them, why are they so much more open and truthful about who he was?
Well, they're very cautionary because he had a quite negative effect on his own family. They were treated as pariahs for 2 or 3 generations. And again, they don't admire the acts and the lengths he went to. They don't see any justification for admiring misdeeds and illegal acts. It's as simple as that. I'm talking with people who that want to be good members of the community. They're respected within their communities. They do not need the baggage of Ned Kelly hanging over their heads. They want to get over that and get on with their lives. And similarly, they see us hurt, and they know that we want to honour our police ancestors, and they're horrified that at different points in time, people have smashed the headstones of these three policemen. People have torn monuments out of the ground at Stringybark Creek dedicated to these policemen. But they are just as upset about that as we are, because these men lost their lives performing their duty, and they do not deserve the degradation and discrimination and the mistruths told of them, to utter falsehoods and demonisation. It is just unfair to those men, and it's most unfair to the descendants of them.
So what have you encountered then since the book's been out for about a month? You're doing quite a bit of press around it. I assume that you have been dragged into some form of conflict, of dialogue with people who don't believe your version of the truth.
So it's been interesting as I've been around. I've only really had three people out of 6 presentations where they had a different view, but using reason and logic and the facts and presenting them back to them. It ended up being quite a short conversation.
So with this book then, it's out. Obviously you want to get to the truth and talk about it, but what else are you hoping for this book to achieve in the longer term?
In the longer term, I hope that Australians look for true heroes, not made-up ones. We do have some very good people in our history in Australia that people can put up on that pedestal, can adopt the same methods as, can stand up for their rights and insist upon change. And they are not made up, they're real. And we don't have to invent from someone who was a bushranger who became an outlaw. We can do better.
Leo, thanks for your time today.
And thank you very much too, Jess.